Ohio is located within two geographic regions of the United States. Ohio is characterized by a humid continental climate with hot summers and cool winters. Precipitation falls fairly evenly throughout the year, and heavy snowstorms are common in winter. Winter 2018 also saw snowfall and cold weather. On January 28, 2018 at 8 p.m., a car was parked outside an apartment complex. A young, blonde-haired girl got out of the car and walked briskly toward the house. She was returning from work. In her hands, she had a bag of food from her favorite fast food restaurant and the keys to the apartment. As she approached the door, she was surprised to find that the key did not go into the lock. The girl hurriedly decided to check each key on her metal ring, but none of them fit the lock. Suddenly, she remembered that she had given her key to her brother and reopened her purse in search of a spare key. When the key was found and the lock was finally opened, an unfamiliar voice called her name, and she turned around. A large male figure grabbed her and carried her into the apartment with nonchalant assertiveness. The door slammed shut. On January 29, 2018, the staff of Shaw Davis Funeral Home was alarmed by the absence of everyone's favorite assistant Rachael at work. She did not answer the phone, which worried them because the girl was very responsible and took her work seriously. The head of the office asked a colleague, who was engaged in delivery, to come to Rachael's apartment to check on her and find out the reason for the silent absence. He went to the girl's apartment, but no one answered his knock or call. He contacted the manager of the apartment complex, but this attempt was unsuccessful, as it was only possible to enter the apartment with the tenant's permission. Her colleague called the police to the place of residence of the missing girl. When they went inside, they found nothing scary. The apartment looked completely normal, except for the leftover food on the table. Rachael, who adored order, couldn't leave food without putting it away in the refrigerator. This caught the attention of her coworker. He insisted on a more thorough inspection of the apartment in the presence of police officers. During the inspection of the bedroom, he tried to look in the closet, but when he wanted to open the door, he thought something was wrong. With effort, he yanked the closet door open and screamed. Hidden inside was Rachael's bloody body. Officer Frank Sclafani called forensics, and the apartment complex area was cordoned off. In her own apartment, Rachael Anderson's bound body was discovered in a bedroom closet. She was stripped to the waist, partially wrapped in a blanket. Her head was wrapped in a shirt, and the black article of clothing was tied around her neck with part of the fabric stuffed into her mouth as a gag. The victim was a young 24-year-old female, Rachael Anderson. Rachael Nicoletta Anderson was born on January 28, 1994, to William Bill Anderson and Patricia Trish Anderson in Warren, Ohio. Rachael had a younger brother, John, who was a common family favorite. She was a 2012 graduate of Warren Harding High School, where she was part of the National Honor Society and played soccer and volleyball. Rachael chose a completely unusual profession. Since childhood, she dreamed of becoming a funeral director. The girl studied at Youngstown State University, where she specialized in the study of the bodies of the dead. She treated her vocation with great importance, for which she got into the list of the best students and received a scholarship. She then attended Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science, where she graduated in 2016 with a Bachelor of Science in Mortuary Science. After becoming a member of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association, Rachael moved to Columbus, where she began her internship at Shaw Davis Funeral Home. She was very reverent about her work and felt it was her duty to support and assist the relatives of the deceased. Her internship was coming to an end, and Rachael dreamed of becoming a full-fledged employee of the Bureau, but her dreams of the future were destroyed and sneakily taken away in the most brutal way. Rachael's body was taken to the morgue, and investigators interviewed the first witnesses. The autopsy performed on Rachael Anderson's body revealed the mystery of the horrific manipulations she had endured that night. The young woman had been strangled and stabbed. She suffered a laceration to her scalp and fractures to the base of her skull. The stab wound went through the back of her neck and penetrated the left hemisphere of her brain. Rachael was stabbed with such force that part of her skull broke off. The autopsy also revealed that she had been strangled with an electric blanket cord, and as a result of the strangulation, she had hemorrhaged in her sternoclavicular muscles and eyelids, and the blood vessels in her eyes had filled with blood. In addition, forensic evidence showed that bruises and red marks on her ankles and wrists indicated that she was alive when the perpetrator tied her up. A DNA sample was found on the rope and on Rachael's body. The coroner who performed an autopsy on Rachael Anderson found that the death was caused by a stab wound to the head and neck, although the initial theory was strangulation. After interviewing several employees from Rachael's work, as well as her ex-boyfriend who had an alibi, police continued to look at different versions of the attack. Detectives returned to the victim's apartment to conduct searches in hopes of finding evidence or traces of the perpetrator that could unravel the case. On the living room floor, they found Rachael's purse, which was missing her wallet. The 9-inch steak knife used to stab Anderson was found by her mother 2 weeks after the crime in a box in her apartment. So detectives had their first theory, robbery. But such a brutal torture of the girl said that the perpetrator was not just a robber, but a skilled maniac who took pleasure in the display of his power over the victim. Investigators considered different motives, and for some time had no suspects, and the manner of the girl's death was not disclosed, maintaining the secrecy of the investigation. After some time, the investigation received DNA samples that were found on several parts of Rachael's body and at the crime scene itself. But, unfortunately, the obtained samples were not recognized by the database of special services. The obtained video from street surveillance cameras showed 2 people who used her car to drive around the city after Rachael's death. At that time, cash was withdrawn from the dead girl's debit and credit cards. Data obtained by the location service identified a phone number that was in Rachael Anderson's apartment from 7:59 p.m. to 9:25 p.m. on January 28, 2018. By examining the evidence, it became clear where the caller was at different times. Having identified the account from the phone number found, investigators were able to identify the suspect. He turned out to be 54-year-old Anthony Pardon, a recidivist, violent criminal and rapist, whose criminal history before the murder of Rachael Anderson included several rapes, as well as robbery, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He spent a total of 33 years in prison for his crimes. The maniac had a hard fate. He was raised by his grandparents before he started living with his mother. As a child, the boy was diagnosed with conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder due to social problems. In March 1979, Anthony, 14, was temporarily committed to the Ohio Youth Commission. In July of that year, he was placed in the custody of the court and temporarily transferred to Franklin County Children's Services. And as late as December, he was again found guilty of making threats and was transferred to the Ohio Youth Commission and placed in foster care. In 1980, Pardon was charged with abuse. The victim was the foster parent's son. Pardon, who was 15 years old when he committed the crime, was babysitting while his foster mother went grocery shopping. He told Columbus police he committed the crime because he was upset after an argument with his girlfriend. Anthony was convicted of the crime as a juvenile. On November 13, 1981, 16-year-old Pardon was allowed to enter the home of his girlfriend's 39-year-old mother to use the telephone. He pulled a butcher knife on her, took advantage of her, and stole $100 from her purse. He then bound her hands and feet, gagged her, and put her in the trunk of his car. He drove her to Valleydale, where he untied her feet and threw her into the river behind the Valleydale ballroom. When the perpetrator saw that the victim, who was partially clothed, was able to stay afloat, he waded into the creek and submerged her head underwater. The woman survived after the intervention of a random passerby who scared Anthony away. The boy then managed to get away before the police arrived and used the money he stole from the victim to buy tennis shoes and jogging uniforms. In May 1982, at age 17, he was convicted of other crimes in Franklin. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment ranging from 5 to 25 years. While in prison, he committed several disciplinary offenses, including possession of a weapon, burning a mattress, and fighting. He eventually spent over 24 years in prison for his crimes and was released in November 2006. Upon gaining his freedom, Anthony Pardon moved to Georgia and applied for a job under an assumed name. But in 2007, he was charged with forgery and was again convicted in Floyd County, where he spent 9 years in prison. He was also given 20 years probation and was required to wear a GPS tracker on his ankle. In 2017, Pardon was released from prison, returning to Ohio in June of that year under an interstate agreement between Ohio and Georgia. He was monitored by the Adult Parole Authority and was required to check in with the Sheriff's Department every 90 days. The Ohio Adult Parole Authority did not provide him with a monitor, as requested by the judge, because of the length of supervision and cost concerns. Due to budget savings and careless negligence of state authorities, a former maniac and criminal was walking free again. So, on August 21, 2017, Pardon was caught with a girl of easy virtue in his car, and 6 days later he was caught driving without a license. During that stop, he was found to be in possession of a kitchen knife and a shotgun. But again, either by some strange coincidence or police negligence, he was not arrested. The perpetrator's escapades continued. One of the CCTV footage shows Rachel's car stopped outside a store. A man got out of the car on the passenger side and headed into the store to store. The driver was not visible on the footage, which added some complications. But after visiting that store and interviewing the employees, the police managed to find out the man's identity. He turned out to be a local vagrant, Anthony Schlitz. A couple of days later, he was questioned at the station. He said that he was approached by a passing mature man and offered to cash in the cards of his ex-girlfriend. He agreed, and thus became a co-conspirator in the Rachael Anderson case. Anthony Schlitz confirmed the identity of Anthony Pardon and outlined the entire route they took on the evening of January 28, 2018, in an attempt to cash out Rachel's stolen cards. The matter remained to be resolved. Find and apprehend Anthony Pardon. On February 9, 2018, a multi-day stakeout of Anthony Pardon's sister's house resulted in his apprehension. The 54-year-old repeat offender was charged with 9 counts, including aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder. On February 4, 2020, the protracted trial began. 4 witnesses testified on the first day, including Rachel's co-worker Jonathan Kennedy, who discovered Anderson's body. Jonathan and the manager of her apartment complex also testified. The jury heard from Officer Frank Sclafani, who was in his car outside the apartment when Kennedy discovered the girl's body and saw the surveillance tape. Rachel's brother John and Special Agent Joshua Durst testified on February 5th, and lead detective Art Hughes testified on February 6th. On February 6th, the inmate complained to the judge about his attorneys, saying he was not satisfied at all and asked for new attorneys. Recidivist Anthony Pardon was intentionally stalling. On Monday, February 10th, prosecutors brought in a latent print expert and other expert witnesses to explain how technology was used to identify where Rachael Anderson's debit card was used and at the crime scene. The defendant's sister also testified that he gave her Rachel's debit card, telling her that it was his girlfriend's card. Later, from television news reports, she learned that the card belonged to the crime victim. The last day of testimony was Tuesday, February 11th. The medical examiner testified that Pardon's DNA was found at the scene, while a forensic pathologist and a deputy coroner from the Franklin County office testified about Rachael Anderson's injuries. In the courtroom, a minute-by-minute picture of the last days of Rachael Anderson's life was reconstructed. On January 26 and 27, 2018, Rachael celebrated her 24th birthday. On the 26th, her brother John traveled from Warren to Columbus to visit her. The next day, she traveled with her brother to the home of her friend and colleague John Kennedy. There, the friends threw a party to celebrate Rachel's birthday. After a long party, Rachael and her brother spent the night at the house of friends, and the next day the girl went from them to work, leaving the key to her apartment to her brother. On the 28th, John Anderson returned to his hometown and accidentally brought the key with him. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Rachael texted John Kennedy, who had a key to her house. She said she would come to his place and pick up the key. Rachael spoke to her mother around 6:30 p.m. and then went and got her key from Kennedy. Since her apartment door could only be locked from the outside with a key, Anderson had to leave it unlocked. She stopped for dinner at her favorite restaurant and pulled up in front of the house at about 7:30 p.m. She then left the apartment. Pardon was waiting for her outside the apartment. He abducted Rachael by taking her from the bottom floor to the top floor. He held her down with savage force while he bound her feet and ankles with a hairdryer cord, then tied her hands with a belt and blinds cords. When the victim was immobilized, he wrapped a curling iron cord between her wrists. To stop her from screaming, he gagged her. The villain forced Rachael Anderson to give him the PIN numbers to her cards. He tortured her and took advantage of her. He then strangled the girl in cold blood with a cord from an electric blanket. In addition to strangulation, the perpetrator also inflicted blunt force trauma and a stab wound to her head. He then carefully hid her body in a closet. He left her there naked below the waist, and with the electric blanket cord tied around her neck and door handle. The perpetrator then stole her car, used all of her bank cards at several stores in Columbus for a quick profit. The defense did not call any witnesses. The final hearing was held on February 12th. Assistant prosecutor Amy Van Keulen made the state's initial closing argument, constructing a chronology of the crime and telling the jury that Pardon massacred Rachael Anderson in cold blood. In defense closing argument, defendant's attorney Larry Thomas acknowledged that Pardon used the victim's cards, but argued that he was not responsible for the crime. The attorney argued that the state's case was based on speculation, and the DNA and cell phone evidence did not prove Pardon's involvement in the crime. The jury, made up of 4 men and 8 women, deliberated for about 6 hours over 2 days before finding him guilty on all counts. The prosecution sought the death penalty because he killed Rachael Anderson in an aggravated burglary because he had a prior conviction for a similar attempted murder of a woman. Prosecutors sought the death penalty instead of clemency because of his extensive criminal history. Prosecutor O'Brien said there are some people who basically cannot behave in accordance with the law, and Anthony Pardon is one of them. The sentencing phase of the trial began on February 18th. A defense seeking to mitigate aggravating factors cited the suspect's troubled childhood to the court and jury. But that didn't work, and prosecutors voiced that the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigating factors. And furthermore, it was proven at trial that Anthony Pardon was fully aware of what he was doing when he attacked Rachael. Pardon's mother and sister, along with a psychologist and his former elementary school teacher, did testify in his defense. On February 19th, Anthony Pardon self-reported a 13-minute unscripted statement to the jury, discussing his abusive childhood. He also spoke about his problems after leaving prison, describing hardship and helplessness. He claimed that the system failed him and no one helped him. In his last statement, he blamed the justice system for who he is today. He did not speak directly about the crime or apologize for it during his statement. On February 20th, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury deadlocked on whether to recommend the death penalty and recommended life in prison without parole. Sentencing took place on March 16, 2020. Rachael Anderson's mother, Rachael Anderson, cried in court as the verdict was announced. The father issued a statement recounting his observations of the investigation over the past few years. He was extremely surprised at how a violent criminal and repeat offender made demands and became hysterical as if he was owed money. The man was shocked as a grown man complaining that the system had failed him, trying in every way possible to absolve himself of even the slightest bit of guilt. In his final statement, the father of the deceased noted that there is obviously blame to be placed on the system, but in the situation that happened, it only failed Rachael Anderson. Judge McIntosh sentenced Anthony Pardon to 1 life sentence without parole for aggravated murder and another life sentence without parole for violence. Anthony Pardon was also sentenced to an additional 63 years in prison for aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery, and multiple violent offenses. The sentences must be served consecutively. An evil fate. It was the 24th birthday for Rachael Anderson. The life of a young woman who had everything ahead of her was cut short. Her internship was coming to an end, and she was about to be offered a promising job. Rachael was buried at Pineview Memorial Park. Her family and friends are having a difficult time recovering from such a sudden loss. Each year, on January 28th, her loved ones light a candle in their homes and remember the blonde-haired, smiling Rachael. After all, to know Rachael meant to love Rachael. She was just a beautiful soul, and she would do anything for any of her friends. Rachael had many hobbies throughout her life. First and foremost was her career. She had the gift of compassion. She loved dancing and socializing with family and friends. She loved children. She loved her life that was stolen from her. The Sumner family case. Buried alive. The worst betrayal is the betrayal of a loved one who enjoyed boundless love and trust. However, despite all the pain, bitterness, resentment, and disappointment, many still cope with it and go on with their lives. But what if the betrayal is learned on the deathbed, and the realization of this becomes the last thing that a person experiences in his life? That's what the horrifying story of the Sumner family is about. This case struck to the heart and brought to tears even experienced criminalists with a huge experience, which in their practice have seen everything, except that the subhumans who committed this heinous crime, despite the initial death sentence passed on them, are still alive and are actively trying to appeal the court's decision. But let's look at this story from the beginning and try to understand how it came to be that a young girl, whom the spouses Sumner loved and cared for as their own daughter, decided to deal with them in the most brutal way. High school sweetheart. James, or simply Reggie Sumner, and Carol Alford were born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. They were the same age, knew each other since childhood, went to the same school, and were in the same grade. Over time, their friendship and childhood affection grew into sympathy. School children themselves did not notice how they began to get closer. In 1959, when the teenagers were 15 years old, a romantic relationship between them, and they began dating. Friends noted how beautiful and harmonious it was a couple, and in the home archives of James and Carol later in life kept their joint photos, where they are young, happy, and ahead as it seemed to them at the time. They are waiting for a long and happy life. For both of them, it was the first time in their lives that their feelings were strong and mutual. The young people were practically inseparable, both in and out of school, and seriously considered getting married as soon as they turned 18. Their parents approved of their children's choice and were not against their marriage, but life had a very different outcome: a long separation. In 1962, the lovers graduated from high school, but they did not have time to get married because a few months later, James was called up for military service in the Army. He and Carol decided to postpone the celebration until his return home and also agreed to write each other regular letters. Time passed, the separation dragged on, and in the mid-60s, the young man was sent to a hot spot in Vietnam, after which contact with him was cut off. Carol didn't even know if her lover was alive because he stopped writing to her. Carol decided to continue her studies, at the same time getting a job at the Charleston Air Force Base. A few years later, she married, but the first marriage soon broke up, and the spouses did not have common children. In 1975, the young woman married a second time to a certain Richard Alford, from whom in 1977 gave birth to their only child, a daughter Rhonda. However, the second marriage was also unsuccessful because the spouse abused hot drinks and regularly raised his hand on his wife. Toward the middle of the 80s, Carol could not stand the constant abuse from her husband, took her daughter, and filed for divorce. But Richard did not leave his ex-wife alone and literally pursued her, trying to spoil her life. And in 1987, he succeeded. He bought a handgun with ammunition, and after another reception of a large portion of alcohol, went to the ex-spouse to deal with her. Alford rang the doorbell, and Carol, unsuspecting, opened it for him. Behind her in the room was 10-year-old Rhonda, but the presence of his daughter did nothing to deter the drunken father, who pulled out a gun and shot Carol several times right in front of the child. He then got into his car, drove to a deserted area, pulled out his gun, and fired the remaining bullet into his temple, dying on the spot. Carol was lucky to survive because the sound of gunshots and the desperate cries of the child were heard by neighbors, who promptly called an ambulance and the police. The young woman was on the verge of death. She lost a lot of blood, and for several days her condition was assessed as critical. She underwent a number of complex operations, blood transfusions, and gradually recovered. Except Carol became completely blind in her right eye and was left disabled for life. Toward the end of the 90s, her health again seriously deteriorated. She did not feel well, noticeably lost weight, suffered from severe pain and weakness. Having undergone a full examination in the hospital, she heard a disappointing diagnosis: liver cancer. As it turned out then, in 1987, when doctors were fighting for her life, her body was accidentally carried the hepatitis C virus, which Carol did not suspect and did not treat the disease. As a result, the virus that affected her liver destroyed it for years, leading to cancer. However, thanks to treatment and properly selected supportive therapy, Carol's condition was stabilized. She had to take her prescribed medications daily for the rest of her life, as well as undergo regular medical checkups to make timely adjustments to her treatment. Carol lost her job at the Air Force Base after suffering severe gunshot wounds. Now that cancer was added to her disappointing diagnoses, she was unable to work physically or be on her feet for long periods of time. So Carol took a job as a call center operator for a cable TV company in her hometown of Charleston. As for James, once in Vietnam, he didn't have a chance to report for a long time. The war dragged on, the man was severely wounded, nearly losing his leg, and spent an extended period of time in the hospital. His name was mistakenly included in the lists of the dead, so even his relatives thought that he was no longer alive. Sumner was lucky enough to survive and return home years later. By that time, the connection with Carol was long lost. She had changed her place of residence, married, and also believed that her first lover had died in a hot spot. Soon, James married, but because of the injuries he received in the war, developed diabetes and a number of other chronic diseases, he was never able to become a father. A few years later, the marriage broke up, and he has lived alone ever since. James took a job as a simple laborer on the local railroad, and no longer expected from life pleasant surprises. The voice sounds painfully familiar. In the fall of 2000, Carol was having a normal workday answering phones and giving advice to customers. When the young woman answered another such call, she heard a familiar voice that sent shivers down her spine. She immediately recognized her first high school love, but she was afraid to make a mistake because she thought James was dead. Carol answered all the customers' questions and then suddenly turned to him, saying his full name. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then the man timidly asked how she knew his name. Carol burst into tears in response and replied that she was the girl he had dated in high school that he had once wanted to marry. For the next few minutes, they both just cried into the tube, unable to utter a word. Then they found out that they still lived in their hometown and agreed to meet the next evening. The meeting 38 years later. According to Rhonda's recollection, her mother came home from work that day excited, looking like a lovesick schoolgirl and talking nonstop about James. The next day, Carol prepared for the date, trying on dresses, doing her hair and makeup. Carol realized that she was no longer the young beauty James Sumner remembered her to be, but she wanted to look good and win back the heart of the man she had once been in love with. It was an exciting meeting for both of them, for the couple had not seen each other for 38 years. They talked about everything in the world and could not talk enough, told each other about the joys and sorrows of their lives, about failed marriages, about work, about health problems, and remembered how happy they were once together. Their old feelings flared up again. James and Carol were eager to make up for the lost years. They began to see each other every day, and after just a couple of weeks, they decided to move in together and start living together. 5 months later, the couple married, and Carol moved into her husband's home in the Riverland Terrace neighborhood. Family life and troublesome neighbors. The couple first resided in their native Charleston, South Carolina. They were in love, happy, engaged in the arrangement of everyday life, and reverently cared for each other because both were not old and had health problems. Next to the couple lived the Cole family, with whom James had been acquainted for many years. The head of their family, named Stephen, had also once fought in Vietnam, was severely wounded, and remained confined to a wheelchair. His wife, Natalie, disappeared at work and afterwards did not hurry home at all, preferring to spend time in the company of friends somewhere in the bar. Their daughter Tiffany was left to her own devices from a young age, often hanging around on the street with nothing to do and no money for even small pocket money. When James and Carol first started living together, Tiffany was still in high school, and good-natured Carol immediately sympathized with the neighbor girl. She genuinely felt sorry for the schoolgirl, who was actually unwanted by her own mother. Carol, for 5 years, in every possible way, patronized Tiffany, invited her to her family lunches and dinners, where delicious food, periodically bought the girl clothes, and even gave money for small expenses. Carol treated her like her own daughter, surrounded her with care and attention. When in 2004, the Sumners decided to sell their car brand Chevrolet Lumina minivan, Tiffany asked if she could buy it from them in installments. Since the girl had no money and she needed the car like air, the couple decided to give her the vehicle for next to nothing. The agreed amount was ridiculous, which was divided into a dozen payments and stretched them over a whole year, a forced move, and a mysterious disappearance. In early 2005, the Sumners decided to move to the sunny state of Florida. It was a forced measure because the health of both spouses deteriorated markedly, and doctors recommended that they move south and closer to the ocean. By that time, they were both retired, so they decided to make a drastic change in their lives. Carol and James sold their spacious home in Charleston and acquired real estate in Jacksonville, the largest and most populous city in Florida. They also purchased a new Lincoln Town car. The couple were extremely happy and settled in a new place, making plans for their future life together. Every day, Carol called her adult daughter Rhonda, to whom she told her about everything that was going on in her life, shared her thoughts and plans. Therefore, the girl was very surprised and excited when one day, in June 2005, her mother did not call her and did not answer her call. At first, Rhonda chased the bad thoughts away from her and hoped that everything was all right with her mom and her husband, and that they would call her back soon. But the next day, the situation was no different. Rhonda called her mother and James's cell phones every half hour, but the phones were now unavailable, and the answering machine on her home phone went off. But all messages went unanswered. On the third day, Rhonda decided to drive herself to another state to see if her mother and stepfather were okay. She left early in the morning and was on the road for about 5 hours before she reached the Sumners' home. The first thing Rhonda noticed was the absence of a car, but that was only the first oddity. When the girl went to the front door, she found that the door was ajar. The house was quiet and there was a light on in one of the rooms, even though the sun was shining brightly outside. Rhonda called loudly for her mother and James, but there was no answer. Then she went into the kitchen, where she saw a table set for two with food that looked like it had been there for at least 3 days. It looked as if the owners had gathered for dinner, but had suddenly abandoned the meal and gone somewhere else. In addition, the house itself was a mess, with things strewn about and some doors and cupboards left open. It seemed as if something had been searched for. But what was it? And who was it? In the couple's bedroom on the bedside table, there were some medications that were vital to them. There were their mother's cancer pills, which she took 3 times a day, and a bottle of insulin, which James took by the hour. In addition, the couple's cell phones were completely dead. Rhonda realized that without their medications and cell phones, her mother and stepfather could not leave the house, let alone leave their home for a long time. So she immediately contacted the police to report the incident. Strange imposters. The couple and their car were promptly put on the wanted list, and all bank cards belonging to Carol and James were blocked the same day. The first few days of the search yielded no results, and it was not possible to find the Sumners themselves or any witnesses hot on the trail. However, on June 12th, several events occurred at once, which allowed the police to get on the trail of the criminals. First, a man called one of the banks. who introduced himself as Mr. James Sumner and complained that his card was blocked and he could not withdraw cash. Upon checking the card information, the bank employee immediately suspected something wrong. He offered Mr. Sumner to contact personally the nearest bank branch to settle the problem, but the man simply hung up. At the same time, almost a few minutes later, from the same number, but already in another bank, a woman called from the same bank who introduced herself as Mrs. Carol Sumner and reported a similar problem with the blocking of the card. When offered to come to the bank in person, she categorically refused, saying that she could not do so for health reasons, but was in dire need of money right now and asked to return access to her savings, which of course was refused. The information about the calls, as well as the recordings of the phone calls themselves, were immediately handed over to the police. On the same day at the station, they were played to Rhonda, who stated with certainty that the voices did not belong to her mother and stepfather. This was obvious from the beginning because both spouses were in their 60s and the voices sounded too young. The police immediately assumed that the imposters are directly related to the disappearance of the Sumners, and they either kidnapped the couple and hold them somewhere forcibly, or killed them, having previously extorted information about bank accounts and cards. The search. A few days later, the missing couple's car was found abandoned on a deserted road in a wooded area. No traces of blood and struggle were found in the cabin, but in the trunk experts found hair and sweat marks, which, as it turned out, belonged to both spouses. It became clear that the owners had been taken away in the trunk of their own car, and there was little chance of finding them alive. When the police checked the couple's bank transactions, it turned out that money had been withdrawn from their cards several times after the Sumners had stopped contacting their daughter. After reviewing the ATM surveillance footage, it was discovered that the money had been withdrawn by a young man who could not be immediately identified. In addition, a request was made to trace all calls from the number from which the imposters called the bank. The SIM card itself, as it turned out, was bought without a contract, with prepaid time, shortly before the disappearance of the spouses. It was not possible to establish the name of the buyer in this case, but it was learned that on June 6th, a call was made from this number to a car rental company. As it turned out, a guest of one of the hotels rented a car brand Mazda RX-8 in the name of Tiffany Cole, and it was on this car later, an unknown young man drove to ATMs where he withdrew money from cards belonging to the Sumners. He withdrew $1,000 from the woman's card and almost $3,000 from her husband's card. Thanks to beacons built into all rental cars to track their location, investigators were able to find out that the already mentioned Mazda RX-8 parked at a hotel in Charleston. There was promptly dispatched a capture team, which literally broke into the room where the attackers were resting, celebrating their impunity. Young thugs. The room was literally littered with packages and receipts from various stores, and among the purchases were clothes, gadgets, video games, cosmetics, perfumes, and a lot of expensive alcohol. Inside was a girl and two guys who were clearly not expecting visitors from the police. They were 23-year-old Tiffany Cole, her 24-year-old boyfriend named Michael J. Jackson, and 19-year-old Alan Lindell Wade. The young men looked surprised, confused, and even scared as handcuffs were snapped on their wrists. All three were taken to the police station and placed in different rooms for questioning, but at first they pretended not to understand what they were accused of or simply remained silent. A search of the room also turned up the Sumners' bank cards, a laptop belonging to the couple, some of Carol's jewelry, James's expensive coin collection, the keys to their Lincoln Town car, and pawn shop receipts in the name of Tiffany Cole. As it turned out, part of the stolen jewelry Mrs. Sumner, Tiffany managed to pawn, and the money spent with friends. After several hours of interrogation, when the irrefutable evidence found in the hotel room was presented, Tiffany was the first to speak. The girl sobbed and claimed that she and her friends had robbed the elderly couple, but did nothing else to them, and then went on the run and started spending other people's money. She also admitted that there was another guy with them, 19-year-old Bruce Kent Nixon, to whom they paid $300 for help and never saw him again. As it turned out, Bruce really agreed to go to the crime, for they promised him a fixed amount, and after that he spent all the money on illegal substances. Finding the guy was not difficult because he lived in the same Charleston and did not even think about running or hiding. He was arrested right at his parents' house. A careless phrase and a devious plan. Bruce once realized how the committed crime could turn out for him, and therefore agreed to cooperate with the police to avoid the death penalty. What the young criminal told caused horror and frost on the skin. It all began in May 2005, when Tiffany went to the Sumners to give them the next payment for the car bought 6 months ago. The girl always went to them personally because hospitable Carol and James invited her to stay for a night or a few days, fed her delicious food, and even spoiled her with gifts. If she came with friends, there was always room for them in the house and at the table. This time, Tiffany arrived with her new boyfriend, and both of them were kindly invited to dinner. And since the time was late, the couple stayed overnight at the Sumners' house. During the meal, the Sumners talked about how they settled in the new place, and Carol inadvertently mentioned that they had almost $100,000 left after the sale of the house in Charleston, so they could live for themselves in their old age, not deny themselves anything, and not worry about anything. With that phrase, Carol effectively sentenced herself and her husband to death. Tiffany and Michael looked at each other, and during the night, while at the couple's house, they began to make plans on how they could get their hands on this impressive sum of money. In the morning, they said goodbye and returned to South Carolina, where in a couple of weeks they found accomplices, distributed the roles and responsibilities of each, and began to realize the plan, the heinous confessions of criminals. On June 6th, Tiffany rented an inconspicuous car, and Bruce and Alan stole 4 shovels from somewhere. Together they drove to the suburbs of Jacksonville, where they chose a deserted spot in the woods and began digging a deep hole that would become the grave of the Sumner couple. On the morning of July 8th, Tiffany bought rope and duct tape at a hardware store, which she gave to her accomplices. That evening, Bruce and Alan knocked on the door of the prospective victim's home, pretended to need help, and asked to be allowed to make one call from their home phone. Carol thought these young men were strange, but she let them in nonetheless, figuring they really needed help. Once inside, they immediately attacked the defenseless woman and her husband, who came running to her screams, threatening them with a toy gun. The couple's hands and feet were tightly bound with duct tape, blindfolded, and questioned about money and valuables in the house. Under torture and death threats, the couple gave the intruders all the details of their bank accounts and the PIN codes of their cards, hoping that their lives would be spared. But as soon as the bandits received the necessary information, 2 more people entered the house. They helped drag the couple into the backyard of the house and stuff them into the trunk of their family car. Driving the Lincoln, and in the front seat were Alan and Bruce, and behind them, in a rented Mazda RX-8, were Tiffany and Michael. In case they encountered a police patrol on the way, who would have intended to stop the car with the couple in the trunk. The second car should have diverted their attention to themselves by accelerating sharply or flagrantly breaking the rules. However, there was no one in their path, and both cars made it to the scene unharmed. In the trunk, James managed to free his arm and removed the bandage and duct tape from his face, and also from his wife's face so she wouldn't suffocate. But there was nothing else they had time to do. What was their surprise, bewilderment, and shock when the trunk lid opened, and the couple saw among their captors Tiffany and her boyfriend, who had recently visited them. The Sumners were led several dozen meters through the woods to a grave prepared for them, after which they simply pushed them there. The couple desperately pleaded for their lives, but the young criminals decided otherwise, killing the couple in the most brutal way imaginable, burying them alive. According to Bruce, they covered them with earth for about an hour, and the whole time the bound elderly people cried, confessed their love to each other, and said goodbye. As the examination later showed, the spouses died of suffocation, and in their mouths, respiratory tracts, and even stomach were found pieces of soil in which they were buried. Having finished their gruesome work, the outlaws abandoned the Lincoln in the woods and returned to town in a rented car. They went to the Sumner house, where they took all the valuable things they could find, and then returned to South Carolina and began to spend the loot. However, after 2 days, the stolen cards were blocked, and after another 4, all participants in the crime were taken into custody, trial and conviction. The only one who from the beginning fully admitted his guilt and agreed to cooperate with the investigation, hoping for leniency, was Bruce Nixon. It was he who showed the burial place of the spouses and told in detail about everything that happened on that terrible night. Tiffany claimed that the initiator of the crime was her boyfriend Michael, who had lost his mind when he heard about the fabulous amount of money that remained with the Sumners after the sale of the house. Her lawyer insisted that the girl was a wingman and was not directly involved in the murder herself. Jackson and Lindell preferred to remain silent, but the collected evidence spoke eloquently for them. The jury did not believe in the innocence of Tiffany Cole because she took part in the development of the criminal plan, rented a car, and came up with a diversionary maneuver if they suddenly chased by the police, helped dig a grave for the spouses, and after renting stolen items in the pawn shop and happy to spend the money. This was evidenced by a lot of photos taken by her in the purchased clothes and in a limousine, which the criminals rented to celebrate their success. As a result, Bruce Nixon was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to ever be released, and Jackson, Tiffany, and Lindell were given the death penalty. The criminals filed multiple appeals and grievances, but they were all denied, and the sentence remained unchanged. Except that in 2023, 18 years after their atrocious crime, that very same death sentence was never carried out. The Summer Baldwin case, buried in suitcases. In the world of criminal investigations, when two or more crimes share similar characteristics, experts often link them as part of a series. It can take years to identify and apprehend serial criminals. Most criminals have experienced violence and abuse as children, and some have varying degrees of mental illness. Nevertheless, they are aware of their actions. To the outside world, these people often seem perfectly normal, so much so that those around them don't notice that they are facing a ruthless killer. Such was the case with Rosendo Rodriguez, an outwardly unassuming young man who served in the U.S. Marine Corps. Witnesses who knew him personally and testified at his trial described him as a friendly, responsible, and good-hearted man who wouldn't hurt a fly. However, it emerged that he had brutally taken the lives of two young women and disposed of their bodies in a particularly extravagant and unusual way. Looking ahead, I will say that this man was justly punished for his heinous deeds. But let's start from the beginning to understand this loud and complex case, learn about his victims, and dive into the childhood of the criminal to understand how he turned into a monster, a naked beauty in a suitcase. This chilling tale began on September 13, 2005, in the outskirts of Lubbock, Texas. A city utility worker performing routine duties at a local landfill noticed an unusual object amid the typical array of colorful trash, a large black suitcase that seemed oddly intact and bulky. Curiosity piqued. He opened the suitcase, hoping perhaps to find something valuable. To his horror, the first thing he saw upon unzipping it was a woman's manicured hand. Initially, he couldn't believe it was a real human body and not a doll or mannequin. On fully opening the suitcase, he discovered the naked body of a young woman, her knees drawn up to her chest, arms crossed around her neck. The worker immediately halted the garbage truck that had brought the grisly suitcase and called the police. The landfill was quickly cordoned off, and the truck and its contents were thoroughly examined. Finding any clues in a vast city dump was nearly impossible, but the investigators hoped to at least uncover hints about the woman's identity and how she ended up there in such a state. No identification or personal items were found in the suitcase. The only distinctive feature on the body was a small tattoo on the leg with the word "Summer." The medical examiners now faced the task of determining the cause of death, while forensic experts needed to identify the victim and track down her killer. An autopsy revealed multiple injuries inflicted while the woman was alive, including signs of sexual violence. However, the cause of death was positional asphyxiation. She was still alive when placed in the suitcase, but suffocated due to the confined space. By the time her body was found, she had been deceased for approximately a day. Fingerprint analysis uploaded to the national database in the United States identified the victim as 29-year-old Summer Lee Baldwin. Who was Summer Baldwin? Summer Baldwin, born in 1976 in Washington, was known for her sweet, kind, and open nature. She was a bright student with a vibrant personality and many friends. Dreaming of an acting career, Summer had high aspirations for her life. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in community college, but university studies were difficult for her. Friends invited her to Texas for a change of scenery and opportunities. Summer moved to Lubbock with the support of her parents, hoping to start her life with a clean slate. It is unknown when Summer's life spiraled, but she gradually became addicted to alcohol and illicit drugs without seeking help from her family. Over time, her addiction worsened, leading to job loss and connections with people with criminal records. Her acting dreams were dashed, and she eventually began working as an escort to support herself. Unaware of their daughter's problems, Summer's parents thought she was leading a successful life. They were devastated when the police informed them of her tragic death in September 2005. The information they provided about Summer's friends and hangouts was limited. Notably, a few months before her death, Summer was a key witness in an important federal counterfeiting case. This suggested that her murder may have been a contract killing by a criminal gang, which drew the attention of the FBI and put the investigation under special scrutiny. The investigation and the first suspects. The first person called in for questioning by the police was Rebecca, best friend of the deceased Summer Baldwin. Rebecca shed light on Summer's occupation and mentioned several of her boyfriends, one of whom behaved aggressively, often raised his hand to her and persistently stalked her after their breakup. That man became the first suspect in the case. Summer's ex-boyfriend was detained and brought to the station the same day, but he categorically denied his involvement in the case. Moreover, he seemed genuinely surprised and upset by the news of her death. He had a solid alibi. The night before the tragedy, he had been involved in a drunken brawl in a bar and spent the night in a cell with another troublemaker. As a result, the police had to release the first and only suspect at the time. Another friend and, so to speak, colleague of the deceased provided the investigation with much more important information. According to a woman named Marjorie, she saw Summer the evening before the murder, and they even exchanged a few words. They met on September 11th in the parking lot of a convenience store. Marjorie recounted that a red van pulled up to the store, from which a young, fit man of Latino appearance got out and went inside, presumably to shop. In the meantime, Summer, seeing her friend, came out from the passenger side to greet her. She told Marjorie that he was her client, with whom she had been meeting for the second time in recent days. After the man came out of the store, he got behind the wheel, and Summer hurried back into the van. Marjorie then went about her business and didn't see which direction the van drove off, nor did she know where the couple planned to have their rendezvous. She added that she had never seen the man before and assumed he was not a local. The only description she could provide was that he had very short hair, like a military man, due to the darkness outside and her inability to see him clearly. What's wrong with the suitcase? The suitcase, which became a young woman's coffin, appeared quite odd. Externally, it was smeared with garbage and waste, yet it wasn't worn out, and its wheels looked new. Inside, all tags were in perfect condition, and the lining seemed as if the item was brand new. Moreover, even the plastic attachment for the price tag was intact, suggesting that the person who bought the suitcase hadn't removed it. It was established that suitcases of this brand were sold in dozens of stores throughout the city, but this particular large model was available only in 2 stores. Thanks to the perfectly preserved barcode, it was discovered that a pair of identical suitcases were sold the day before the grim discovery at a Walmart store in the same area of the city where the girl was last seen alive. The first purchase was made after noon, and the second around 2 in the morning, which was quite strange and suspicious. Police officers immediately went there and requested the store's surveillance camera footage. Upon reviewing the material, they found that the first suitcase was bought by an elderly couple. These people were not initially suspicious, but they were located, and they could present the suitcase and explained that they bought it for a vacation trip. The second suitcase, however, was bought by a young man of Latino appearance, athletic build, and with very short hair, like a military man's. Suspicions arose that this was the person mentioned by the witness who saw him in the company of the deceased girl in the parking lot of the supermarket. Moreover, the man also bought a pair of disposable gloves at the checkout. Further information was provided by the external surveillance cameras installed in the store's parking lot. They showed the man exiting with the suitcase in hand and loading it into a red van. Too many coincidences led the police to believe they had found their man, and all that remained was to establish his identity, locate, and bring him in for questioning. Hunt for the stranger. The man was extremely cautious, using cash instead of a card to avoid leaving any personal data. However, he didn't account for the surveillance cameras in the parking lot, which captured his vehicle's license plate number perfectly. Police quickly identified the vehicle as a rental in the name of Rosendo Rodriguez, a U.S. Marine Corps reservist. Rodriguez had no criminal record and hadn't previously come to police attention. He was in Lubbock for a few days with his unit for training. Finding Rodriguez immediately was challenging as he wasn't at the hotel where his unit stayed. However, police had his details and discovered he had withdrawn a large sum of cash from an ATM at another hotel, likely the money used to pay for the suitcase and gloves. Rodriguez hadn't stayed at the hotel where he used the ATM. Instead, someone named Thomas Rodriguez, matching Rosendo's description, had checked in on September 11th. It turned out to be the same person using a different name for unknown reasons. Luck favored the investigation. The hotel room rented by Rodriguez, which he had already checked out of, hadn't been cleaned yet, yielding crucial evidence. There were brown stains and splatters on the carpet, bed, and walls that resembled dried blood. A tag from a new suitcase was found near the bed, and the trash contained used contraceptives and disposable gloves. Forensic analysis confirmed the dried blood in the room belonged to Summer, and DNA on the contraceptives and gloves matched both Summer and Rodriguez. There was no doubt they had found the murderer, but by then, Rodriguez had already left the city. However, with all necessary information, tracking him down was straightforward. Rosendo Rodriguez III was born on March 26, 1980, in Wichita Falls, Texas, into a poor family of Mexican immigrants. Reports suggest that he experienced violence and harsh treatment in his early childhood. His father, described as domineering and aggressive, struggled with alcoholism and frequently abused his wife and children. During his childhood, Rosendo also displayed aggression, often getting into fights at school. However, as he grew older, he learned to control his anger. After high school, he attended Texas Tech University and moved away from his parents. Living independently, he worked various jobs, including at a pizzeria, as a courier, and as an office clerk, before deciding to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps. Colleagues in the military described Rodriguez as quiet, balanced, disciplined, and responsible. He was seen as a good friend, always ready to help, well-educated, and physically attractive, making him popular with women. Rodriguez was arrested on September 15th at his home in San Antonio. When police arrived, he was calm and seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation. During the search, a striped shirt and shorts were found, matching the outfit he wore when purchasing the suitcase caught on surveillance footage. Additionally, his laptop and mobile phone were seized, interrogations, and Rodriguez's version. For the first few weeks, Rosendo remained silent and denied involvement in Summer Baldwin's murder. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, so following his attorney's advice, he started giving statements with his version of events, which differed significantly from the scenario built by the forensic experts. Rodriguez began by explaining that he had accidentally booked a hotel separate from his fellow servicemen. He knew only the name of the hotel chain they were supposed to stay at, chose a hotel randomly, and only after checking in did he realize the rest were at a different location. He chose not to relocate as the military leadership indicated it wasn't necessary. He failed to explain why he registered under a different name. On the morning of September 10th, Rodriguez rented a van for convenience around the city. That evening, he claimed to have met Summer Baldwin by chance. According to him, he saw a blonde woman sitting on a bench by the road, covering her face with her hands as if she was crying. Intrigued and concerned, he stopped to check if she was okay and needed help. They struck up a conversation. She calmed down, and then they went to his hotel room where they talked and drank a bit, but did not become intimate. The next morning, Rosendo drove her home, but they agreed to meet in the evening. He picked her up at the same place around 9 p.m. and went to a supermarket, where Summer saw her friend Marjorie. They then returned to the hotel, where Rodriguez said there was consensual intimacy between them. Afterward, however, Rodriguez said Summer became aggressive and demanded money, which surprised him because he did not realize he was with a call girl. When he refused, she allegedly pulled a knife out of her purse and began threatening him. He disarmed her and punched her in the face, causing her nose to bleed. Rodriguez claims he did not intend to harm her, but acted in self-defense. Moments later, Summer collapsed on the bed and convulsed, foaming at the mouth. He stated that he tried to help her, but refrained from mouth-to-mouth resuscitation because of the blood and foam on her face. After a minute, she stopped breathing. Realizing she was dead, he panicked. He went to the nearest store, bought a suitcase and gloves, returned to the hotel, put her body in the suitcase and threw it in the dumpster, knowing that it would be taken to the landfill the next morning. He then checked out of the hotel, returned the rental car, and drove home to San Antonio as if nothing had happened. Inconsistencies in the suspect's story. Investigators immediately realized that Rosendo Rodriguez was lying because there were numerous inconsistencies in his story. For example, Marjorie, who met Summer in the parking lot the night of the crime, claimed that Summer told her explicitly that the man was a client of hers with whom they had previously had a paid meeting. Rodriguez claims that everything between them was consensual, but evidence on Summer's body indicates that she was taken advantage of. It is likely that their first night was indeed consensual, which is why Summer agreed to meet him again. Moreover, Rodriguez claimed that he only hit Summer in the face once to calm her down, but she died of a seizure. However, an autopsy found about 30 fresh bruises on Baldwin's head and body on the night of the crime, and several stab wounds. In addition, she was alive when he packed her in the suitcase, contradicting his claim that she was already dead. Another girl in a suitcase. During an investigation at Rodriguez's residence, police seized his laptop computer. A review of his search history revealed a disturbing pattern. In the 3 days prior to his arrest, Rodriguez had been actively searching for information about a girl named Summer, paying attention to whether there was an ongoing search for her and whether her body had been found in a landfill. Interestingly, Rodriguez also frequently searched for Joanna Catherine Rogers, a 16-year-old girl from Lubbock who went missing a year and a half ago. When authorities offered Rodriguez a plea bargain in exchange for information about Joanna's fate, a deal that included a reduced sentence and avoided the death penalty, he reluctantly accepted and told his story. He met Joanna, a high school student in Lubbock, in late April 2004. After a few meetings, they went to his hotel room on May 4th. The situation turned tragic when, after an argument over money and threats of a lawsuit for rape, Rodriguez panicked and covered Joanna's mouth to silence her and inadvertently caused her death. In a desperate attempt to dispose of the body, Rodriguez put it in his own suitcase and threw it in a dumpster. This method replicates the disposal of Summer's body a year and a half later. Rodriguez initially confessed to these actions, but later recanted his testimony, claiming coercion. Realizing the need to find Joanna's body to strengthen the case, police undertook a massive search of the city dump. More than a year later, they miraculously found a suitcase containing Joanna's remains. Despite severe decomposition, DNA testing confirmed the identity of the remains. This evidence allowed authorities to charge Rodriguez as a serial offender, committing similar heinous crimes with a consistent modus operandi. Trial, verdict, and execution. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the gravity of his crimes, defendant Rosendo Rodriguez hoped to avoid the death penalty until the last moment, expecting a life sentence with the possibility of parole. However, the court decided otherwise. The decisive factor was the fact that Summer Baldwin was 3 months pregnant at the time of her tragic death. This aggravating factor was decisive, and the court found Rodriguez guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death by lethal injection. Rodriguez and his lawyers filed multiple appeals, citing errors and misconduct by investigators, but all were rejected. While in prison awaiting execution, Rodriguez even maintained his own blog on criminal justice and policy issues. On March 27, 2018, nearly 10 years after being convicted of his heinous crimes, Rosendo Rodriguez was finally executed. This occurred the day after his 38th birthday. The death sentence was carried out in the Huntsville prison in Texas. This execution was the fourth in Texas, and the 7th in the United States for the year 2018.